September 12, 1942. Guadalcanal, 9:30 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson stands in total darkness on a razor-thin ridge of coral and grass. 1 mile behind him, Henderson Field, the single airstrip keeping 12,000 Marines alive on this godforsaken island. 1 mile ahead, complete silence from the jungle. But Edson knows what's coming. He can hear them down there. 3,000 Japanese soldiers moving, preparing, getting ready to sweep his 840 exhausted Marines off this ridge like leaves in a hurricane. The math is simple and brutal. If this ridge falls tonight, Henderson Field falls tomorrow. If Henderson Field falls, every Marine on Guadalcanal dies. Edson turns to the hollow-eyed men around him, kids who haven't slept in 36 hours, whose uniforms are rotting off their bodies, who are shaking with malaria even as they grip their rifles. He doesn't talk about glory. He doesn't mention God or country. He just says, hold one more night. What happened in the next 12 hours wouldn't just save Henderson Field. It would shatter Japan's most dangerous illusion about this war and turn the tide of the entire Pacific campaign. This is the story of the night that changed everything. Summer 1942, Japan's moment of supreme confidence. Let's rewind 6 months to understand why tonight matters so much. Summer of 1942. Japan isn't just winning the Pacific War, they're dominating it so completely that American planners are genuinely considering whether the war can even be won. Look at the scoreboard. Hong Kong fell in 17 days. Singapore, the impregnable fortress that Britain had spent decades fortifying, surrendered in 70 days. 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops marched into captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, 3 months. Burma, gone. The Philippines, gone. Wake Island, gone. In 6 months, Japan had captured an empire spanning 5,000 miles, from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, the greater East Asia. Co-prosperity sphere wasn't propaganda anymore, it was reality. But Japan had won something even more valuable than territory, something more dangerous than any weapon. They had convinced themselves of a lie. Japanese commanders genuinely believed, not as propaganda but as military fact, that Western soldiers couldn't fight. They had watched British troops surrender by the tens of thousands at Singapore, many without firing a shot. They had seen brave American defenders on Bataan ultimately collapse after months of starvation. They had crushed numerically superior Chinese forces through sheer aggression and willingness to die. The conclusion seemed obvious. Asian soldiers possessed a spiritual strength that Westerners lacked. The Bushido Code, the warrior tradition, gave Japanese troops an edge that no amount of American industrial production could overcome. One Japanese soldier was worth 10 Americans. This wasn't rhetoric. This was accepted military doctrine. Officers were staking thousands of lives on this assumption. Japanese military intelligence made it worse. Their reports on American Marines read like fever dreams. Marines were prison inmates given a choice between combat or incarceration. They were undisciplined, poorly trained, likely to break under pressure. The garrison on Guadalcanal? Maybe 2,000 men, probably less, demoralized, poorly supplied, ripe for destruction. When Imperial headquarters planned the recapture of Guadalcanal, they allocated forces based on fighting a weak, frightened enemy that existed only in their imagination. They never considered that reality might be catastrophically different. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had no illusions. His Marines had landed on August 7th with 17 days of supplies. The Navy had pulled out after the disaster at Savo Island, leaving his force isolated on an island they barely controlled. Japanese aircraft bombed Henderson Field every day. Japanese warships shelled them every night. Japanese reinforcements poured in via high-speed destroyer runs the Americans called the Tokyo Express. His men were hungry, sick, surrounded by an enemy that grew stronger while their supplies dwindled. By any rational assessment, the situation was desperate. But Vandegrift knew something Tokyo didn't. He knew what Marines were actually capable of. These weren't prison inmates. These were the product of the most rigorous infantry training in the American military. Marine recruit training lasted 13 weeks, longer than any other service. Every Marine received 147 hours of rifle instruction at Parris Island, nearly triple what Army soldiers received. Every Marine qualified as a rifleman before learning any other specialty. This wasn't marketing. This was doctrine, established after 1899 when the Commandant discovered that fewer than 100 Marines in the entire Corps could meet basic marksmanship standards. The Corps had spent 4 decades fixing that problem. By 1942, Marine marksmanship was legendary. Qualification standards that would mark an Army soldier as expert barely met minimum requirements for Marines. But marksmanship was just the foundation. Since 1934, Marines had trained specifically for the most difficult military operation in existence, amphibious assault. They had literally written the book on it. The Tentative Manual for Landing Operations became the foundation for amphibious doctrine worldwide. The Navy adopted it, the Army adopted it, even the British used it. Between 1935 and 1941, Marines conducted 7 massive fleet landing exercises, working out doctrine for naval gunfire support, close air support, and infantry tactics against fortified beaches. They developed requirements for landing craft that could carry troops directly onto hostile shores. They trained through painful trial and error, learning what worked and what got men killed. No other military in the world had invested this level of effort into storming defended coastlines. The Japanese were about to discover what that training produced. Tenarue River, August 21, 1942. 2 weeks before Edson's Ridge, the first lesson was delivered. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 9017 elite Japanese soldiers, veterans of the China campaigns who had never known defeat, across a sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River. Ichiki was a decorated officer. His regiment had participated in the conquest of Guam. They expected to sweep through the American lines in a single night. They attacked at 2 a.m., screaming, bayonets fixed, absolutely certain they would shatter the Marines as they had shattered every other enemy. The Marines were waiting. Machine guns covered the sandbar from multiple positions. Riflemen had registered their weapons during daylight. Barbed wire stretched across the approaches. When Ichiki's men charged into the darkness, machine guns opened from 3 directions simultaneously. Tracers cut through the packed formations. Riflemen fired with the accuracy that hundreds of hours on the range had burned into muscle memory. The Japanese charge hit a wall of fire and disintegrated. Wave after wave came forward. Wave after wave was destroyed. Bodies piled on the sandbar until the Japanese who followed had to climb over their own dead. By dawn, the carnage was total. Marines counted more than 800 dead Japanese soldiers. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors to prevent capture, then shot himself. American losses, 35 killed. When reports reached Tokyo, staff officers refused to believe them. The numbers had to be wrong. Japanese soldiers didn't die in those ratios, but they did, and they were about to again. Tokyo's response doubled down. The defeat at Tenarue was attributed to Ichiki's overconfidence. He had attacked with only half his regiment. Tokyo reasoned that a stronger force, properly coordinated, would succeed where Ichiki failed. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi brought 3,000 men through the jungle to attack from the south. His route took weeks to traverse, hacking through vegetation so dense that progress sometimes slowed to a few hundred yards per day. His plan was sound. His troops were fresh, and he had chosen as his target the ridge where Lieutenant Colonel Edson waited with his 840 raiders. September 12, 1942. Edson understood what was coming. Intelligence had detected Japanese movements. Coast watchers had reported the Tokyo Express delivering reinforcements. The ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field was the obvious approach. Edson positioned his men carefully. The 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion spread across a 1,000-yard line. They dug fighting holes in rocky coral. They cleared fields of fire. They registered artillery coordinates, and they waited. 9:30 p.m. Hell arrives. The assault began with a Japanese cruiser and 3 destroyers shelling the Marine positions. Shells crashed into the ridge, sending coral fragments spinning through the darkness. As the bombardment lifted, the first waves emerged from the jungle. What followed was 12 hours of combat so intense that veterans would struggle to describe it for the rest of their lives. The Japanese attacked in waves, hurling themselves through waist-high kunai grass. Officers led with drawn swords, screaming commands. Enlisted men followed with fixed bayonets. Grenades arced through the darkness. Machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red, gunners pouring water on the mechanisms to keep them functioning. Marines fought with bayonets when ammunition ran low, with knives when bayonets broke, with entrenching tools and bare hands when nothing else remained. The fighting was so close men could smell their enemies, so dark that friend and foe were distinguished only by shape and sound. Midnight. The center of the Marine line buckled. A company of paratroopers was nearly overrun, its commander killed, survivors falling back in confusion. Japanese soldiers penetrated to within 1,000 yards of Henderson Field. Some reached the edge of the airstrip itself. Edson was everywhere. Standing on an ammunition box in full view of the enemy, silhouetted against artillery flashes, he directed fire, repositioned units, and rallied men on the edge of breaking. At one point, with the line collapsing and Japanese forces pouring through, Edson encountered Marines falling back in disorder. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We can't hold them." Edson's response became legend. "By God, you will hold. Now get back there and do it." They held. 3-M, the final crisis. The situation reached its breaking point. Japanese forces had punched through the center and were pouring toward the airfield. Edson had committed every reserve. There was nothing left. Major General Vandegrift, waiting at his command post, later admitted this was the only time during the entire Guadalcanal campaign that he doubted the outcome. Then artillery arrived. The 11th Marines had registered their guns during daylight. Now, in darkness, they fired mission after mission onto the Japanese assault columns. 105mm shells tore through packed formations with devastating effect. The jungle erupted in continuous explosions that turned approach routes into killing grounds. The Japanese advance stalled, fragmented, then broke entirely. Dawn reveals the price. Morning light revealed the scale of the victory. More than 600 Japanese bodies lay on the ridge and in the jungle below. Some counts reached 800. Many more wounded had been dragged back into the jungle. Marine casualties, under 200, with fewer than 60 killed. Kawaguchi retreated with the remnants of his brigade. He had started with 3,000 men. He would emerge months later with a fraction of that number. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, was over. Among the Marines, the word was simple. They had held, against 3-1 odds. Darkness, with everything at stake. They had held. It was exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Among the Japanese, the word was different. Doubt. For the first time, Japanese soldiers had thrown themselves against an American position with everything they had, and been slaughtered. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui, serving with the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, recorded his thoughts in a diary that would survive the war. He had witnessed the aftermath of both Tenaru and Edson's Ridge. He had seen the bodies piled on the sandbar. He had heard survivors describe machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Their firepower overwhelmed us," he wrote. "We had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory." This was a professional soldier's private assessment, never intended to be read by anyone, and it captured something profound. The Japanese were beginning to understand that their assumptions about American infantry were catastrophically wrong. Inui noted another revelation. Based on wishful thinking by Imperial headquarters that the United States Marine Corps were about 2,000 or so, Ichiki's force was divided and dispatched to Guadalcanal with small arms. The reality? 12,000 Marines held the island. Japanese intelligence had been wrong by a factor of 6, but understanding came slowly. Tokyo wasn't ready to accept that its soldiers were being outfought by the men they'd dismissed as soft and undisciplined. More troops were sent, more attacks ordered, more bodies piled up. The battle for Henderson Field in late October brought 20,000 Japanese soldiers against the Marine perimeter, the largest ground assault of the campaign. The Marines held again. Over 3 days, approximately 3,500 Japanese dead, American losses under 300. The pattern established at Tenaru and Edson's Ridge was repeating across the entire perimeter. By February 1943, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. They had landed approximately 36,000 troops on the island, over 6 months of desperate fighting. Japanese losses, 20,000, 30,000 killed, plus thousands more from disease and starvation. Marine and Army ground forces, roughly 1,600 killed in action. The myth of Japanese military invincibility died on Guadalcanal. It died on the sandbar at Tenaru. It died on Edson's Ridge. It died in the mud and jungle around Henderson Field. And Japanese commanders knew it. What Tokyo understood, and what took the rest of the world longer to grasp, was that Guadalcanal wasn't a fluke. Marines had developed a way of fighting that the Japanese couldn't match. The key was the fire team structure Marines had developed before the war. By January 1944, Marine infantry squads consisted of 13 men organized into 3 fire teams of 4 men each. Each fire team had a leader, an automatic rifleman with a Browning automatic rifle, an assistant, and a rifleman. 3 automatic weapons per squad. Army squads of the same period carried only 1 bar. Marines could generate 3 times the automatic weapons fire at the squad level, the basic building block of infantry combat. In the close-range fighting of Pacific Islands, this was decisive. A Marine squad could suppress an enemy position while maneuvering against it, using 1 fire team to pin the enemy and 2 to attack from different angles. The question was whether Japan could adapt. The answer came written in blood across islands whose names became synonymous with Marine sacrifice: Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. At Tarawa in November 1943, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men couldn't take his fortress island in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was appalling. Nearly 1,000 Marines dead, over 2,000 wounded. But of the 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 survived to surrender. At Peleliu in September 1944, the Japanese unveiled a new defensive doctrine. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa abandoned beach defenses and banzai charges. Instead, he placed his 11,000 men in 500 caves carved into coral ridges. What was predicted to be a 4-day battle lasted 73 days. The 1st Marine Regiment suffered such catastrophic casualties, it was rendered combat ineffective. American casualties exceeded 8,000. Japanese losses approached 11,000. The Japanese had found a way to multiply their defenders' effectiveness. The Marines had found their tactics were no longer sufficient. Both sides were learning. By 1944, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was assigned to defend Iwo Jima. Unlike most Japanese commanders, Kuribayashi had spent years in America. He'd visited Detroit and observed American industrial capacity. He'd studied American military thinking. Most importantly, he'd studied Tarawa with professional intensity. Kuribayashi concluded that everything about Japanese defensive doctrine needed to change. No more beach defenses. American naval gunfire would destroy them. No more banzai charges. Every soldier who died in a pointless frontal assault was wasted. Pull back inland. Fight from caves and tunnels where American firepower couldn't reach. Make them pay for every yard. The Marines would face Kuribayashi's new doctrine at Iwo Jima in 1945. But that evolution, that adaptation, began on a coral ridge on Guadalcanal. It began the night Edson's 840 Marines held against 3,000 Japanese soldiers. The night they proved that American infantry wouldn't break. The night that changed the Pacific War. On September 14, 1942, as dawn broke over Bloody Ridge, Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson looked at his exhausted Marines. They had held one more night. Just like he asked, Edson would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. He would survive the war, though the sounds of that battle, the screams, the explosions, the machine gun fire, would haunt him for the rest of his life. But on that morning, standing on a ridge soaked in blood, he knew something that Tokyo was only beginning to understand. The myth was dead. The Japanese military wasn't invincible, and the United States Marine Corps wasn't going to break. The road ahead would be long and brutal, island after island, each more heavily defended than the last. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. It was decided on a ridge 1 mile south of Henderson Field. On the night 8:40, Marines refused to yield, on the night that changed everything.